Well, hey, welcome to part 3 of our series, Life with No Rules. I'm so excited that you're joining us for our time as we're exploring this amazing life that God has for us. And so whether you're a rule breaker or a rule keeper, I'm so excited that you're here. I believe God has something more for you. In part 1 of this series, we looked at what a life with no rules looks like and what rules actually do and what they don't do and how we respond to them. And last time, we talked specifically about rule keepers and what the positives and negatives are about having that type of perspective of the world. And we talked about how it's hard for rule keepers to acknowledge their need for God. But it's special when it happens. And so this time is all about rule breakers. You know, the rule breakers are the ones that when they saw this series, they're like, yeah, I'd love a life with no rules. I could do whatever I want. And it's that type of thinking that makes rule keepers really cringe. Rule breakers are the ones that, you just don't like to do what you're supposed to do or what you're told to do. And even if you wanted to do it, you're not that good at it anyway. But being a rule breaker is not always a bad thing. Rule breakers oftentimes make the most innovative changes for good in the world. Back all those years ago when people were driving horse and buggies around and people were trying to figure out how they could make this a better situation, how they could make the wheels on the buggy better or the horses go faster. There was a guy by the name of Henry Ford that decided, you know what? I don't need to make a better horse and buggy. I'm making a car. And that changed the world. That changed everything. And that type of thinking was a way of thinking outside of the box, of not following the rules. And the same kind of situation happened about 10 or 11 years ago when people were using these things called cell phones. And they were making calls, emergency calls from their car, just in case, And there was a guy who came along, Steve Jobs, that said, hey, what if I put a computer in your hand? Instead of just having a device that made phone calls, what if you had a device that literally did everything? Was a flashlight, was a calculator, accessed the internet, controlled your lights, made phone calls and sent text messages, but literally did everything in your pocket. What difference would that make? And that broke all of the rules, and it changed the world. But on the other hand, there's a lot of negative things that come with being a rule breaker as well, as you can probably imagine. There are moral laws and rules in every nation for a reason. And some people will do just about anything or literally everything to get what they want. And there was a guy a couple years ago that broke many important national rules to get what he wanted. And what he wanted was a 13-year-old girl. And in order for this guy to get this girl, he went into her house, killed her parents, and kidnapped her. And after 87 days, this girl escaped and was saved. And shortly after, this guy was put in jail on 2 charges of intentional homicide along with kidnapping and armed burglary counts. So unfortunately for rules could not do anything to prevent this guy from breaking them. Rules had to rely on the authorities to enforce the rules. And so this guy was put in jail for breaking the rules, and he was confined to a small space with minimal resources where his freedom was greatly constrained. He couldn't break as many rules as he once could. But sometimes in this place of minimal freedom and the ability to break rules, people find this life with no rules. Sometimes the most free people in the world are stuck behind bars. I personally got to experience this when I went to prison when I was in college. And now you might be thinking, didn't last time you say that you were a rule keeper and now you're in jail? What are you talking about? Well, I'm glad you asked. Get this. I'm such a rule keeper that pretty much my only familiarity with jail and prison is when I went there for prison ministry. So I remember going to this facility with the group of people, and I remember going into the entryway, the way you get into the jail, and just going through all these locked doors and rooms and walking through these layers of barbed wire and entering into the main jail area. And I remember being ushered through there with armed guards and seeing the people with guns up along the walls. And I remember seeing the prisoners running around the yard, working out along the track or doing pull-ups and sit-ups. And it was a very, very eerie feeling. And it's a feeling that, like, I don't ever want to go back into a situation like that where I know I'm not getting out the same day, if you know what I mean. But we went into this building where this chapel service was being held, and I had the opportunity to share my story with the prisoners and everyone there that day, and it was a wonderful experience. It's one that I literally will never forget, but it's not because of what I said or what I had the opportunity to do. It was because of what a prisoner said, and actually what he did. This won't have the same effect on you as it has on me, but I just want to share with you, like, imagine if you were in a room right now, if you were in your room and you were in a room with prisoners, 50, 60, 100 prisoners. Now, of course, you don't know why everyone's there. I didn't know why everyone was there in this room. But, you can use your imagination. You can, they've done some stuff in their life. Let's just leave it at that. And they've ended up where they are. And you're in a room with all of these people. And one of the people gets up and grabs a Bible. And he goes and stands in front of the group of people. And then he reads these words. He says, "Therefore, since we have been made right in God's sight by faith, we have peace with God because of what Jesus Christ our Lord has done for us. And because of our faith, Christ has brought us into this place of undeserved privilege, where we now stand and we confidently and joyfully look forward to sharing God's glory." What freedom! What peace! What an amazing life that God can give to someone even behind bars. God has a special heart for rule breakers. It's the people that he came for. And so he tells these stories that just celebrate rule keepers coming to God, being healed by God, being forgiven by God, being restored by God. And one of those stories is the one that we read last time in Luke chapter 18, a story of a rule keeper and a rule breaker. The rule keeper Pharisee and the rule breaker tax collector. And these two men went up to the temple to pray. One a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, "God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get." But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven. He beat his breast and said, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." And I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. See, the rule breaker in this story is the tax collector. And tax collectors in the first century, when this was written about them, were very, very despised, especially in the nation of Israel, because they were collecting money for the evil empire of Rome. And Israel did not want to be ruled by Rome. So think about how you feel when you pay your taxes to a country or a nation that, maybe at least you live in it, right? But they're paying taxes supporting a government that they think is so evil, and it's not even a part of the nation that they're in. They're being occupied, And so they're paying this money to this evil empire. And what makes it so much worse is that the people collecting the taxes, they would take more than what they would give to the government. So if the government required $100, the tax collectors would collect $150. And what would they do with the extra 50? They would keep it. They would pocket it. They would take it. Oh man, that makes me mad. But what makes it even worse than that is oftentimes these tax collectors that was stealing from their people were Hebrews, they were Israelites, they were Jewish people. They were then working for the evil empire, stealing their people's money. And man, that makes me upset at them. And I lived 2,000 years after that situation. And it's so that person that Jesus says went to the temple to pray. And while the Pharisee stood by himself, this person stood at a distance. And oftentimes it's these people that are breaking so many rules or that feel ostracized. They feel unwelcome and left out. They can't really fit into the organization of the world or especially of God and church. Rule breakers don't really know how to follow the rules, and they're not really good at it anyway. In school, in a classroom, they're the ones that are being told, hey, you're breaking too many rules, go into the hallway. And pretty soon, rule breakers feel like the hallway is where they're supposed to be, and they don't even want to get back into the classroom where there are more rules. And Jesus goes on to then tell about this tax collector, and he couldn't even look up to heaven. He beat his breast. And see, a posture that we have says a lot about what we're feeling and what we're saying, what we're doing. He was showing great sorrow, despair, and regret. And so this tax collector went to the temple to pray, but he couldn't even look at the person he was talking to, the person he was praying to. See, our posture communicates a lot. And oftentimes you can point out a rule breaker just by looking at them and the way that they carry themselves. And then we get insight into what this tax collector, this rule breaker, says and what he prays. He says, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And more about that in a second. But I want to take a second to look at how his prayer compares to the prayer of the rule keeper. The rule keeper thanked God that he wasn't a sinner, and the rule breaker acknowledged that he was. And the rule keeper prayed a lot about himself, and the rule breaker prayed about himself a very little bit and more about God that could do something about it. And Jesus concludes the story that he tells by saying that it's the rule breaker, the tax collector, that went home justified before God. He was right in this situation, because those that humble themselves will be exalted, and those that exalt themselves will be humbled. Both people went to the temple for the same reason, to pray. And both people prayed completely different prayers based on their perspective and worldview of how they viewed themselves, of how they viewed the world, of how they viewed God. And so the one that exalted himself because he felt like he could keep all the rules and was good, he's going to be humble. But the humble one that knew that he couldn't live up to all of these rules and he couldn't follow the rules, he was going to be exalted. And this is the upside down nature of the way that the kingdom of God works. Those that think they're right, those that think they're good, well, they're going to be last. And the ones that think they're last and the ones that aren't good enough, well, they're going to be made first. And this plays out differently in each one of our lives. Do you think that you're good enough to be right with God? Do you hope to get to heaven one day? If so, how many rules are you trying to keep to get there? And how's that going for you? See, if we think we can get there on our own efforts, we're going to end up in last place. But if we trust and believe in someone who put himself in last place for us, then we will get there. And check out how this great exchange works in the mind of this tax collector we are reading about in this story. Remember what he said? He said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. This word mercy is a special word. It's only used one other time in the New Testament. And what the tax collector is doing here is he's saying he went to this temple, and inside the temple there was two rooms, the holy place and then the Holy of Holies. So the tax collector is standing outside of these spaces, and he knows what's inside. And so what he's saying is inside the Holy of Holy place is a piece of furniture, and on top of this little table is called the mercy seat. And it's there that once a year the priest would go and sprinkle the blood of the sacrifice of the animal that would cover the sins of the nation of Israel. And again, remember, this was before Jesus died, and so this temple was there, this sacrificial system was happening. They trusted a lot in the way that God had arranged it for that time. And so the tax collector is outside the temple, and he's saying, God, inside your temple, right over there, is what's called the mercy seat. And God, because the priest did the sacrifices the right way, because the animal who didn't do anything wrong died in my place, his blood was shed in my place. God, you don't have to give me what I deserve. I deserve death. I deserve punishment. I deserve consequences for my sins. But for some reason, you've set it up where this innocent animal was able to take those consequences for me. And so, God, I'm trusting in that. I'm trusting you. I'm believe that this animal died in my place because of me and my sin. And I can be forgiven. I can be set free. I can be right in your sight because of that. This idea of mercy is not just an abstract idea of not giving me what I deserve. It's not like you play that game with your wrist and somebody's bending your wrist back, right? And it's like, mercy, mercy, okay, fine. You know, God's just not like, okay, I give up. I'm not going to punish you. I'm not going to give you the consequences for your actions. No, those consequences were paid for by an innocent animal. And now today, of course, there's no mercy seat, there's no temple, because Jesus' death was the sacrifice now in your place. That animal had to be sacrificed every year. And they did sacrifices all throughout the year. But Jesus only had to die one time. And he died to pay the penalty, the consequences for your sin, your past, present, and future sin of all time. And Jesus did what these animals could not do. He came back from the dead. He overcame sin. He overcame death. And he proved to the world and to God, to everyone, that his sacrifice was sufficient, that God was satisfied by what Jesus did. Jesus in my place. Jesus was the only rule keeper that could keep all of the rules. And I'm good enough as a rule breaker because of what he did, and that's what this is all about. So in our next session, we're going to explore this amazing free life that comes when you're not worrying about keeping the rules or breaking the rules, but you're worrying about a faith and trusting in the one who kept all the rules for you. It's about a relationship with this one, this Jesus that changes everything. It changes the rules of the entire game. So I want to end today by talking directly to the rule breakers. What is God saying to you right now? How have you seen yourself through this story in our time together today? Do you wish that you had a seat at God's table? Do you wish you felt welcomed and accepted by God, God's people, or the church? God came for those who are sick and who are hurting. God came to set the captives free, to heal the brokenhearted. You are who God came for. Over and over again, we read in the Bible and God's Word that God has a special place. Jesus has a special place for rule breakers like you. There was a woman that didn't fit in. She made too many mistakes, and Jesus came and sat next to her at the well. There was a man with a skin disease that made him live in isolation, and Jesus went to go see him and touch him and embrace him. There was a woman with an issue of blood that made her unclean and everything around her unclean, and she touched Jesus. But instead of Jesus being made unclean, Jesus made her clean. There was a woman who was caught in an act of adultery, and Jesus, who was the only one there who had the ability to punish her, to bring her consequences, said, I don't condemn you. Go and sin no more. How is this possible? How is any of this possible? It shows that there's something special about Jesus. He wasn't just a good man that taught nice things. He was God. The perfect Son of God, the perfect Son of God who lived a perfect life. And he was one of us as a human, yes, but he was more than just a human. He absorbed in himself all of the pain, suffering, and evil of this world and made things right. And I believe that he says to rule breakers that he knows rules don't have any power to help you keep the rules. And I see that. I know that. There's something inside all of us that can't live up to the standard. So I'm going to do something about that because you can't. I'm going to take the ultimate consequences for your actions upon myself, and I'm going to pay for it. Then I'm going to do something only God can do, come back to life to overcome the consequences and change the game. Now it's not just about living right, but it's about living with the right person. And Jesus says that I did that for you. So won't you be with me and trust me? Try it. It'll change your life. But more about this next time.